Okay, let's talk about quartertones. And conceptually, quartertones are probably the easiest kind of microtone to understand, as they exist literally in between a traditional half step, right? So yeah, it's pretty easy to just understand the idea of stopping for a new note directly in between the ones we're already familiar with. But using quartertones musically can be quite a bit of a challenge, and from my perspective, as someone who turns to the harmonic series as the ultimate guide of natural harmony, I think there's good reason for this. So we do kind of have quartertones in the harmonic series. If we continue the harmonic series past the 7th harmonic, which was the subject of my previous video, which you should watch, we encounter a new harmonic identity once we hit the 11th harmonic. Now, it's a little hard to hear if we just play the harmonics, but I'll try. There's also a node that exists right here. So that note is right here. And it's definitely a bit of a spicier interval than the 7th harmonic. And it's different from just about any interval we're used to from 12 tone. And I think there's two reasons for why this interval sounds so intense. Foreign, even out of tune. One is just the fact that it's a high prime harmonic, right? So it can be kind of hard to hear the consonants in general. But the other reason, I think, is because this harmonic sits just above a perfect fourth. So the blue tape here marks off a quarter tone, and specifically on this string, it allows me to find the 11th harmonic really quickly. These strings, like in my last video, are tuned C, D, G, C, D, G, so dad-gad up a fourth, and if you know your notes well enough and your intervals, you'll know that this 11th harmonic, just based on where I'm playing it, as I said, sits just above a perfect fourth. So this interval sits directly in between a diminished fifth and a perfect fourth, or augmented fourth, depending on how you want to look at it. Since I'm in the key of G, I can call this note C quarter tone sharp. And given that fourths are pretty consonant, well-known sounds, I think sharpening it by this micro amount, from my perspective, contributes to that sense of unease. It's almost like you kind of want to hear the fourth. And it sits very close to a diminished fifth. That's an interval that already communicates a sense of tension or mystery. So the ear is, I think, a bit lost at first when it hears the 11th harmonic, especially if you don't hear it as a consonance right away. But it can be a really intense interval to play with, and we can use the term undecimal to describe this kind of harmony. So I'm going to play some music with it now, and I'm going to use some other harmonics. I'll be using the 5th and the 7th and the 3rd, just to kind of contextualize this 11th harmonic so you can really hear what it does musically. There is something about the major third, right, the fifth harmonic, which I think makes it a little bit easier to hear the 11th for some reason. It moves from, you can move from the fifth harmonic, or if we raise it, the 10th harmonic, right, to the next harmonic pretty easily, I think. So the 11th harmonic is not the only harmonic series interval that gives us a quarter tone. There are at least two others that I like playing with a lot. The first one I want to highlight is the 33rd harmonic. Now this is essentially a quarter tone that sits just above our root or fundamental pitch, so we can call this a G quarter tone sharp. And you can hear that this interval produces a very intense beating sound that's quite distinct from the shimmery chorus-like effect I demonstrated in my previous video on septimal harmony. So for an example of that, here's a septimal comma, the 63rd harmonic, I think? Yeah. Or it might be 64, I forget. But the point is to compare that sound with this sound. Which is very distinct from just a half step. That's kind of the smallest amount of dissonance you can get from 12 tone playing it strictly. Now another interval I quite like is the 99th harmonic, and this is a quarter tone above our traditional perfect fifth. So these intervals that I've introduced so far, our 33rd harmonic, our 11th harmonic, and our 99th harmonic, these are pretty intense. They produce quite a lot of tension, which I really enjoy playing with. We don't have to stop there by dividing by 11 or multiplying by 11. Because we have this very concept of a quarter tone that exists in between a half step or a traditional half step, we can start to play around with what many folks call neutral intervals. And this is when we play a note that exists almost exactly in between the division of major and minor. And in my previous video, I talked about how the 7th harmonic gives us access to newer kinds of major and minor, particularly the subminor interval. But in that case, with septimal harmony, we still have this kind of major and minor identity. The 11th harmonic gives us the ability to sit directly in between those, however, giving us neutral thirds, neutral sixths, neutral sevenths, or even neutral seconds. Now, of these, I tend to favor the neutral second quite often. As a matter of fact, there's a higher harmonic that gives me a different kind of neutral second that I prefer a little bit more, but I'll save that for the video on the 13th harmonic. So naturally, if you have an instrument that can play justly tuned intervals, such as the lap steel, slide guitar, violin, other fretless instruments, you can start finding quarter tones and undecimal harmony just by listening for that 11th harmonic. So again, it's a quarter tone sharpened fourth, so you can practice just playing a little bit sharp. And it's a tough consonance to hear it first, so you might have to spend some time really listening to it, but after a while you can hear where the note just wants to sit in that 11th harmonic interval. And then naturally, you could find like the 33rd harmonic just by playing a quarter tone above your root note. You can get a pretty crazy Phrygian scale if you do that. Or maybe I'll use the 11th harmonic instead as the fourth there. Or I'll use a neutral seventh. So this is like a Phrygian neutral second, maybe not quite a neutral fourth, harmonic fourth, maybe we can call it. I don't know about that term though. And then neutral seventh. Or I'm sorry, this might not be called a neutral second. We probably would call this a quarter tone flat minor second. If I combine it with some of the septimal principles from my previous video, we could get a septimal minor along with this quarter tone. If you're playing on a traditional guitar, you can just learn to bend in quarter tones pretty easily. Again, just start by listening for that 11th harmonic that exists just above the perfect fourth. You can also just play an instrument in 24 EDO. That gives us access to a bunch of 11 limit intervals across 24 equal keys. Unlike the 7th harmonic though, I do find that the 11th is a little harder to hear as a consonance and a little harder to hear in terms of musical utility. It really represents a substantial pivot in the kind of music you can make. Despite this interval being difficult to hear at first, I do think it's worthwhile because you get these like fascinating dissonances. All right, so that's a bit about quarter tones and the 11th harmonic. If you have any questions, drop them below and be sure to subscribe. I'll be doing a video soon on the 13th harmonic. But for now, enjoy the 11th.